They arrived expecting ruins. What they found instead would rewrite every calculation, every assumption, every comfortable lie they had told themselves about the island across the channel. The German generals stepped onto British soil as prisoners, but what they witnessed in those first hours would haunt them far longer than their captivity. Something had changed, something fundamental, and there would be no going back. For years, Germany had operated on a singular certainty. Britain was finished. The Blitz had torn through London. Convoys burned in the Atlantic. Singapore had fallen. Tobruk had been surrendered. The newspapers in Berlin spoke of an exhausted empire, bleeding resources, clinging to a war it could not sustain. German intelligence reports painted Britain as a nation on the edge of collapse, industrial capacity crippled, manpower depleted, morale fracturing under the weight of total war. The generals believed it. Why wouldn't they? The evidence seemed overwhelming, but evidence can deceive, and assumptions, once embedded, become dangerous. When the first high-ranking German officers were captured in North Africa and transferred to Britain for interrogation, they carried with them those same assumptions. They expected to find a kingdom in twilight, factories limping along, ports barely functioning, a military infrastructure held together by desperation and American charity. They did not expect what came next. The journey itself revealed nothing. Blindfolded, transported in the backs of military vehicles with windows painted black. The German officers knew only that they had crossed water, that the air had changed, that voices around them spoke in clipped English accents. They were moved through processing centers with procedural efficiency, stripped of personal effects, photographed, documented, assigned prisoner numbers. Still, they saw nothing that challenged their expectations. Then came the first transport to the detention facility. The blindfolds came off, and the road stretched before them. One officer would later write in his diary, "I looked out the window expecting to see a country on its knees. What I saw instead made my blood run cold." The roads were not empty. They were choked with traffic, military convoys moving with precision, trucks laden with supplies, armor carriers painted in fresh camouflage. The vehicles were not old. They were not makeshift. They were new, manufactured, rolling off production lines that, according to every German intelligence estimate, should not have existed at this scale. The factories in the distance did not smolder. They roared. Smokestacks pumped industrial exhaust into grey skies. Rail yards hummed with activity. Cranes swung over dockyards where ships, destroyers, corvettes, transport vessels sat in various stages of completion. The rhythm of construction echoed across the landscape like a mechanical heartbeat. This was not a nation in decline. This was a nation mobilized. The detention camps themselves were temporary facilities, but they were organized with an efficiency that unnerved the prisoners. Barbed wire perimeters, guard towers manned around the clock, regular patrols. But more than that, beyond the fences, the activity never stopped. Day and night, the sounds of Britain at war filtered through. Aircraft overhead in tight formations, the distant rumble of artillery practice, the mechanical grind of industry that never seemed to rest. The German officers began to talk among themselves in hushed tones. Where was the exhaustion they had been told to expect? Where were the signs of a nation stretched beyond breaking? One general, a veteran of the Eastern Front, remarked to a fellow prisoner, "I have seen what total war does to a country. I have seen it in Russia. I have seen it in our own cities. This does not look like a country losing." But the full scope of what they were witnessing had not yet become clear. That revelation would come during interrogation. The British intelligence officers who questioned the German prisoners were professionals. They did not gloat. They did not threaten. They simply asked questions, precise, methodical, designed to extract information about German positions, supply lines, command structures. But the interrogations also became something else. They became psychological operations. The rooms were deliberately positioned. Windows overlooked airfields where squadrons of bombers lined up in perfect rows. Hurricanes, Spitfires, Lancasters. The prisoners could see them through the glass. Hundreds of aircraft, ready, maintained, operational. The British interrogators never commented on the view. They didn't need to. The message was silent but absolute. We are not running out of planes. One captured Luftwaffe officer stared at the airfield for a long moment before turning back to his interrogator. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were told your production was crippled. We were told you couldn't replace losses. How is this possible?" The British officer smiled faintly. "You were told incorrectly." But aircraft were only the beginning. As weeks passed, the German prisoners were occasionally moved between facilities. Each transfer offered new glimpses of Britain's transformation. Convoys carrying tanks, Churchills, Cromwells, American Shermans rolling alongside homegrown designs. Munitions depots stacked with shells that gleamed under tarpaulins. Ports where Liberty ships disgorged cargo with assembly line precision, then turned around to collect more. The numbers didn't make sense, not according to what German intelligence had reported. One senior officer, a former logistics commander, began making quiet calculations based on what he observed. Vehicle production, troop movements, supply distribution. The figures he arrived at contradicted everything Berlin had claimed about British industrial capacity. Either German intelligence had been catastrophically wrong, or Britain had hidden the true scale of its war economy behind a veil of misdirection. Both possibilities were terrifying. Because if Britain could do this, if it could absorb the punishment of the Blitz, the U-boat campaigns, the defeats in North Africa and Asia, and still expand its military production, then the fundamental assumption underlying German strategy was false. The assumption that Britain would exhaust itself, that it would negotiate, that it would break. None of that was happening. At night, in the barracks, the German officers spoke in low voices. Some refused to believe what they were seeing. "It's theatre," one insisted. "They're showing us what they want us to see, moving the same equipment past us again and again to create an illusion of strength." But others weren't so sure. "I've been counting," another officer said. "Different serial numbers on every tank. Different tail markings on every aircraft. This isn't an illusion. This is all real." The debates grew heated. Some clung to the narratives they had been fed. Britain as a fading empire, sustained only by American aid, on the verge of collapse. Others began to accept a darker truth. They had been lied to, or worse, they had lied to themselves. One general, a man who had commanded divisions in France, sat silent through these arguments. When asked for his opinion, he simply said, "We should have invaded in 1940 when we had the chance. Now it's too late." The room fell quiet, because everyone understood what he meant. The window had closed. The moment when Britain stood alone, vulnerable, reeling from Dunkirk, that moment had passed. And in the time since, while Germany had turned east toward Russia, Britain had not collapsed. It had grown stronger. For the prisoners, the experience became an exercise in cognitive dissonance. They had fought for a regime that promised inevitable victory. They had been told that Germany's enemies were weak, decadent, incapable of matching German discipline and production. Yet here, on British soil, surrounded by evidence that contradicted every pillar of that narrative, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable question. What else had they been wrong about? Some doubled down on ideology, retreating into rigid belief systems that dismissed observable reality as propaganda. Others fell into silence, their confidence eroded by the weight of what they had witnessed. But a few, those with the clearest military minds, began to understand the strategic implications. If Britain had this level of industrial capacity, if it could sustain losses and still expand its military, then the war in the West was not winding down. It was preparing for something larger, something inevitable, an invasion, a return to the continent, a reckoning. Among the most unsettling sights for the German prisoners were the airfields. Not because of the number of planes, though that alone was staggering, but because of the operational tempo. Day after day, bombers departed and returned. Crews rotated in shifts. Ground crews worked through the night under floodlights, repairing damage, rearming aircraft, preparing for the next sortie. This was not a defensive air force conserving resources. This was an air force on the offensive. The prisoners could hear it. The deep thrum of engines warming up in the pre-dawn hours. The roar as formations lifted into the sky, banking toward the channel. And hours later, the sound of them returning. Sometimes fewer than had left, but always replaced by the next wave. One captured pilot, a veteran of the Battle of Britain, watched from behind the wire as Lancasters taxied past. He had flown against the RAF in 1940, when every British fighter had been precious, when losses mattered, when the balance hung by a thread. This was different. This was industrial warfare at a scale he had not imagined Britain capable of sustaining. "They're not defending anymore," he muttered to a fellow. "Prisoner. They're preparing to destroy us." In early 1943, a new group of prisoners arrived. Officers captured in Tunisia after the collapse of German positions in North Africa. They brought with them fresh reports of British and American forces, coordinated, well-supplied, overwhelming in their material advantage. The conversations in the camps shifted. No longer did anyone seriously argue that Britain was on the verge of collapse. The debate now centered on a more chilling question. How long until they bring this force back to Europe? The evidence was mounting from every direction. Reports filtering through the Red Cross. Letters censored but still revealing. And most telling of all, the simple observable fact that British production had not slowed. It had accelerated. Factories ran on multiple shifts. Shipyards launched vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. Training camps churned out new soldiers with mechanical regularity. The island that Germany had tried to starve, to bomb into submission, to isolate and demoralize, had instead transformed into a fortress of industry. And standing behind it, the economic might of the United States, pouring in resources, equipment, manpower. The generals in the camps could see it now with terrible clarity. Germany was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay the inevitable. The psychological toll on the prisoners deepened. These were men who had believed in their own superiority, who had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries with ruthless efficiency, who had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, convinced that willpower and tactical brilliance could overcome any material disadvantage. But here, in the quiet of British detention, they were forced to watch as the very assumptions that had driven their victories crumbled. Some wrote letters home, heavily censored, trying to convey warnings without triggering the censors. Others simply stopped writing. What could they say? That everything they had been told was wrong. That the enemy they had underestimated was stronger than anyone in Berlin wanted to admit. There was no comfort in the truth, only a slow, creeping dread. By late 1943, the question was no longer if Britain would return to the continent. It was when. The prisoners could sense it in the increased activity around them. More troops training, more equipment moving, the tempo of operations shifting from sustained defense to something more purposeful, something gathering. In the camps, conversations turned to speculation. Where would they land? Calais? Normandy? Would it succeed? Some of the more experienced officers, those who understood logistics and naval operations, ran through the calculations. The number of ships required, the air superiority needed, the coordination between British, American, and other Allied forces. The conclusion was always the same. If they can do it, we cannot stop it. Not with German forces divided across multiple fronts. Not with the Luftwaffe depleted. Not with resources stretched across an empire that had grown too large, too fast, without the industrial base to sustain it. Germany had won its early victories through speed and concentration of force, but in a long war of attrition against an enemy that could outproduce, outman, and outlast them, there was no path to victory. Only delay. The war would continue for 2 more years after that realization settled in the minds of the captured German generals. 2 more years of fighting, of destruction, of cities reduced to rubble, of lives consumed in a conflict that, to those men sitting behind British barbed wire, had already been decided. They would not be there to see the landings in Normandy, They would not witness the collapse of the Western Front or the fall of Berlin. But they had seen enough. They had stood on British soil, looked out at the factories and the airfields and the endless convoys, and understood what it meant. Germany had lost the industrial war. Everything that came after was simply the working out of that equation. Some of the officers would return to Germany after the war ended, walking through ruins that confirmed what they had already known. Others would remain in Allied custody, watching from a distance as the Third Reich disintegrated. But for all of them, the memory remained sharp, the moment when they arrived expecting to see a broken nation, and instead saw the machinery of their own defeat humming with unstoppable momentum. They had been shocked, and in that shock they had glimpsed the future. A future where belief and willpower were not enough, where industrial capacity and sustained production determined outcomes more than any tactical brilliance or ideological fervor. They had thought it impossible, but standing on British soil, surrounded by the evidence of their miscalculation, they learned otherwise. Britain had not collapsed, it had endured. And now, it was coming for them. The generals would carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives, not as a lesson in defeat, but as a warning about the cost of certainty, about the danger of believing too completely in your own narrative, even as the world around you tells a different story. They had seen the truth too late, and truth, once revealed, cannot be unseen.